Hi friends. As I was editing this video, it occurred to me that I've covered the material in the first section in a few other videos. Sometimes you just have to go over the same ground for the story to make sense. However, I promise you that there's material later in the video that I've never taught anywhere until this week. So if you start watching this and you find yourself thinking, oh God, it's not this again, then please use the chapters, which I've put in both the description and the comments, to find a better starting place. Thanks for watching. Okay, let's go on and have a look at the Brythonic Modron in the Welsh texts and begin to reinforce the connections between the various texts for you. So we know that Mabon and Modron are mother and son, simply because of Mabon's name. And in Culhwch, we get a very short version of their story. There's no hunter in the world who can handle that dog. We talked about Dridwen last week, except Mabon, son of Modron, who was taken from his mother when he was 3 nights old. No one knows where he is or what he is, whether he's alive or dead. So Mabon has been stolen from Modron and he's missing. And then in the search for Mabon among the animals in Culhwch and Annwfn, we have this repeated question, repeated like a mantra almost. By God, do you know anything about Mabon, son of Modron, who was taken on the 3rd night from between his mother and the wall? But in this manuscript, we get another story about Modron. This is quite a late manuscript from the 17th century. The manuscript is romantically known as Peniarth Manuscript 147. And this translation is from Rachel Bromwich in her book on the Triads. Now pay attention, because this is the main story that we have about Modron. In Denbighshire, which is part of Wales, there's a parish called Llanferris. And in that place, there's Rhyd y Gyfarthfa, the ford of barking. And in ancient times, the hounds of the country came together to the edge of that ford to bark. And no one would dare go to see what was there until Ieuan Rheged came. Ieuan was the big king of the north of Britain around Hadrian's Wall in the 6th century. And when he came, that is Ieuan, came to the edge of the ford, he saw nothing but a girl washing. And then the hounds stopped barking, and Ieuan Rheged seized the woman and had sex with her. And then she said, God's blessing on the feet which have brought you here. Why, he said, because a destiny was placed on me to wash here until I begat a son by a Christian. I am the daughter of the king of Annwfn, the other world. Come here at the end of the year and you will receive a boy. And so he came and he received there a boy and a girl, namely Owain ap Ieuan, and Morfudd, Ferch Ieuan, daughter of Ieuan. Modron isn't identified by name in this text, but in another version of the same story, which we'll look at in a bit, she is. So we know it's definitely talking about Modron. So there's quite a bit to think about there. First, Ieuan Rheged is a real historical person. So this piece of folklore is suggesting that Ieuan of Rheged, probably the greatest king in North Britain in his time, had sex with a supernatural woman who bears him 2 children. Then there's the barking dogs. These are apparently barking because they know there's something uncanny going on at this ford. But it's this which draws Ieuan to the ford, so he and Modron can unite. In other Welsh tales, a scene featuring hunting with dogs is often a precursor to an encounter with an otherworldly being of some kind. And that encounter is usually instigated by the hunting dogs. So while Ieuan isn't exactly out hunting here, the scene is quite similar in other ways, that he's responding to the action of the dogs. So in spite of the wording that Ieuan seized her, I wouldn't personally take this to be a rape. Sometimes that's suggested in commentary, but in the next moment, Modron blesses him, which is unlikely in the case of a rape, I would think. So then Modron goes on to say that she was destined to wash at this ford until she could get a son by a Christian. Now, there's two ways we could take that. In Irian's day, in the late 6th century, the Britons were at least nominally Christian, had been for a while, but it's very patchy. Some kings, yes, some kings, no. Some tribespeople got the memo, some didn't, So when she's saying, I was waiting for a Christian, the Saxons, very much the enemies of the Britons at the time, they were still pagan. So this could be saying, I was waiting for a great British nobleman like Irian to come along. But sometimes in stories featuring the Tylwyth Teg or the British idea of the fairy folk, Christian means a mortal, an ordinary human, as opposed to one of the Tylwyth Teg. So it could be either of these things. She could have just been waiting for a mortal to come along. So we'll just look at the other text, which talks about this. So this is from the Welsh triads, which are usually lists of 3 things that are similar in different stories or that happened 3 times in history or the genealogies of Wales. So here we have Triad 70, the 3 fair womb burdens of the island of Britain. And what it's talking about is multiple births. So Irian and Evrathel, that's his twin sister, children of Cynfarch the Old, were carried together in the womb of their mother. So Irian is a twin. The second, Owain, son of Irian, and Morvith, his sister, so Owain and Morvith are twins, who were carried together in the womb of Modron, daughter of Afallach. Twins are often an indication in mythology of divinity of some kind. So the triad here, it's perhaps 400 or 500 years later than Irian's time. It's difficult to date the story itself. Could be much older. I'm guessing it's probably somewhat older than that. It's possible that this is a genuine folkloric story in which the greatest regional king mates with a local goddess of sovereignty, hopefully ensuring his greatness as a ruler, which Irian seems to have been a great ruler. He's remembered in a very positive way as a great military strategist and a really generous king and so on. Equally, this could be a story created by a bard praising one of Owain or Morvith's descendants in order to create an impressive ancestor story for his patron. So in the first story that we looked at, Modron identifies herself as the daughter of the king of Annwfn. That's the Brythonic otherworld. In Triad 70, she refers to him by name as Afallach. So Afallach means apple orchard or relating to apples, of apples, Afallach. If you like my videos, please share them, comment, or give them a thumbs up. There's more free content on my Patreon page and on my website. If you're feeling spontaneous, you could buy me a cuppa on Ko-fi right now. All the links are below this video. Now, it seems likely that Afallach is the same deity who was worshipped down here in southern Gaul as Abellio, down near what's now the border with Spain. This deity may also have been known in North Britain, perhaps as Aballo. So he's changed from Abellio to Aballo as, we go through different dialects. There's a Roman fort on the shore of the Solway, and this fort was known as Aballava, the place of Aballo. And there are stories of a fairy king called Evelyn or Everling and his daughter Modron in that part of Cumbria. And he may also be the same unnamed deity referred to by Pomponius Mela in the 1st century. This was a geographer, one of these wonderful geographers, who was overseeing an island just off the coast of Brittany where 9 virgin prophetesses lived. So let's look at that quote. So the Isle of Senna, now known as Ile de Seine, belongs to a Gallic divinity and is famous for its oracle, whose priestesses, sanctified by their perpetual virginity, are reportedly 9 in number. It's quite a long quote, so I've just cut the most interesting bits out for you. They have been endowed with unique powers. They stir up the seas and the winds by their magic charms, that they turn into whatever animals they want, that they cure what is incurable among other people, that they know and predict the future. And then he goes on to say, they only predict the future to sea voyagers who have traveled there to consult them. So if you just get shipwrecked there, you don't get a prophecy. But if you go there on purpose, then you can have one. So this in turn appears to be something which is also referred to in the 10th or 11th century poem in the book of Taliesin called The Spoils of Annwfn. So this is Taliesin, the great bard, speaking here, and he's always very grandiose, right? He's always the biggest, best bard in the world in his poems. He says, I am fair in fame. My song was heard in the four-cornered fortress, revolving to the four quarters. My first word of the cauldron it was spoken. Now Taliesin has a history with a cauldron and the goddess Ceridwen in Welsh lore. Of the cauldron it was spoken, by the breath of 9 maidens it was kindled. So Taliesin, as well as being a poet, is a prophet. The cauldron of the chief of Annwfn, what is its nature, with its dark rim and perils? And then just a little later in the same stanza of this poem, he finishes off with, we went with Arthur, sad conflict, save 7, none returned from the angular fort. So this is a poem recounting a disastrous raid on the other world by Arthur, who goes to the other world in a ship. It's a difficult poem to interpret. It's quite mystical, but it contains some very interesting descriptions of Annwfn. However, let's not stray too far from Afallach himself. So that's what the name looks like written down. Like many individuals, Afallach begins to diverge at some point, so that we find a version of him in the Brythonic tradition and a somewhat different version of him in the Arthurian literary tradition, which starts with Geoffrey of Monmouth and flourishes on the continent with guys like Chrétien de Troyes. So Brythonic folklore pops up in the literary tradition sometimes. Occasionally it looks like it didn't come from Geoffrey, that people are still getting bits of the Brythonic tradition and adding them to the Arthurian literary tradition. One of these is the transformation of Afallach into versions like Eveling or Everling in Cumbria, which is of course Mabon territory, and Irian territory, or Evelake in the Grail legends. And we think in the Iron Age, we had Aballo in Cumbria. And then in the same general part of the world, there's a little bit of folklore remaining about Eveling, call him Afallach if you like, and Modron, associated with this old Roman fortress ruin here on Hardknot Pass. And then really close by, nearer to the coast at Ravenglass, these are actually ruins of a Roman bathhouse. People somewhere in time forgot that these were Roman ruins, and there's folklore about this also being Afallach and Modron's fortress, or Eveling and Modron's castle. So it's probably time to just look at a map and get all this together in our heads. So you can see all this green stuff is what I've just been talking about, how close it all is to the concentration of Mabon and Maponos sites. Some of this, at least, appears to be native. It's not just Romans, it's just Romans recording it. And some of these are place names, which may have nothing at all to do with the Romans, like Lochmaben and the Clachmaben Stain and so on. There's also a couple of other places with apple names. So Aval in Afallach means apple. So there's Appleby in Westmoreland here, where the famous horse fair is held every summer. And then right smack beside Lochmaben, there's a place called Applegarth. Now, B, the ending in Appleby and Garth are Saxon endings, word endings. And we don't know, because there's no records going back far enough, whether these places had Brythonic apple names or not. This brings us to the question, Avallach's territory is obviously a place of apples. So people naturally think of Avalon, and there's a widespread belief that Avalon is Glastonbury, which is way too far south to be on this map. However, I think it's a mistake to try and place Avalon or the Isle of Apples at any point in the physical landscape, or to assume that Avalon and Annwfn are necessarily exactly the same thing. In Irish lore, one of the versions of the otherworld is called Afallach, the place of apples. So this is obviously something which is running through the Celtic tradition. And Afallach is generally ruled over by Manannán mac Lir and placed on the Isle of Man. This is the Isle of Man here. But the Isle of Man in Irish understanding is still the Isle of Man. It's still a real physical place with Manx people living on it. But it's also Afallach, the place of apples. Just look, though, how close all this stuff is. It's quite interesting. So these are the two sites associated with Modron and Avallon, or Avallach, Appleby. And this is where the fortress of Abalava was, which we think must have originally been a cult place of Aballo. And it's just right in the thick of all the stuff to do with Mabon or Maponos. Avalon or Annwfn or Afallach, the other world, it might be in the Ile de Seine or on the Isle of Man or in Cumbria, or it might be Glastonbury. It might be all of these things and none of these things. So I know this raises the question of who is the king of Annwfn, because there are a few candidates. And that can be quite confusing when you're reading Welsh lore. In Irish lore, it's usually Manannán mac Lir. We can be fairly clear on that. In Welsh lore, it doesn't seem like it's Manawydan fab Lir, his cognate, but there are a few people who are in the frame, Arawn, Avathac, Gwyn ap Nudd. But the early Celtic conception of kings wasn't of high kings, of everything, high kings of an enormous, a nation. There was no real idea of nationhood at that time, even in Ireland. It was more regional kings whose borders were in flux. So just don't be concerned about that one time it's Arawn and another time it's Avathac. It's probably more sensible to see an array of kings whose functions or territories in Annwfn we just don't understand.